Phineas, and you can see my face with some makeup on in Call the Midwife next year in a little episode, and I am in The Crown, which is the new series from Netflix coming out next year as well.
Look at you go-getters with all your achievements. Wonderful. These are three of my favourite guests on this show. I'm so glad they were here for this Christmas special. Thank you very much for listening. If you enjoy this, do tell your friends, spread the word. It means a lot. And follow me on Twitter if you want, on @TomCrane. Have a lovely Christmas. See you all soon. Bye.
Give it a 5-star rating.
Yeah, do that. This isn't over. Can you even do that? I don't know. Just a thumbs up, whichever. Do whatever you want. Thank you.
Radio X.
Tom Crane's Story Show.
Hi everybody, it's Andy here. Just before we start this week's episode of No Such Thing as a Fish, we wanted to let you know that we have a live show coming up. We are going to be at the Latitude Festival on Saturday, this weekend. So if you are there, we're going to be at the Literary Arena at 6:15 PM, and it should be great fun. So if you are at Latitude, come along, and we may even give you a badge. Alright, on with the show.
Wait, not on with the show, because we also need to mention that this episode is brought to you by us, but also by Squarespace. Squarespace is that website which allows you to build your own website, which you can start doing right now if you go to squarespace.com, and they really are excellent. They give you loads of template options, so the site that you make will look really professional, really like, you know, you actually know what you're doing. Millions of people use Squarespace already. Become one of them. It's just £5 a month, and if you put the offer code FISH into the little box at the end, you can get 10% off your order. Okay, on with the show.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of No Such Thing as a Fish, a weekly podcast coming to you from the QI offices in Covent Garden. My name is Dan Schreiber, sitting here with Anna Jasinski, James Harkin, and Andy Murray. And once again, we have gathered around the microphones with our 4 favourite facts from the last 7 days, and in no particular order, here we go. Starting with you, Andrew Hutto Murray.
My fact is that babies practice their first words before saying them out loud. Which is very sweet. I love that.
Wait, how do we know?
Well, this is from a study at the University of Washington, where scientists scan babies' brains and observe what happened when they were being spoken to. And bits of their brains light up, different parts of the brain light up. And some of the bits are associated just with listening and taking in information. Other bits are associated with actually planning the motor movements that you need to say words. So even when they're listening, they're trying to figure out how to make that sound, basically. So that's what it is. It's just them figuring out how to make sounds.
But don't they all finally reach the same word? Is it all mum?
No.
Is it not?
No.
I thought that was the first word.
George Orwell's first word was supposedly beastly.
Really good.
That says more about his mother than about him, I
Yeah,
think.
that's true. Considering you're at Animal Farm, though.
That's true. Dada is the most common. 15% of babies apparently have dada. Followed by daddy, 13%. Mama, 10%. Dad, 10%. Mummy, 8%. Mum, 7%. Cat, 2%. Dog, 1%.
I found a survey from 2014 where more than 1 in 8 parents claimed their child's first word was a tablet, as in a tablet computer.
Yeah.
Although this was a technology firm who made device protection cases, who sponsored the research, and it also found that babies break tablets a lot.
So they sponsored the research, and by coincidence, that's the word that comes out.
Babies, I think, might be a lot cleverer than we give them credit for. There was a study done where they tested whether 100-hour-old babies, so a bunch of babies who are only a few days old, could count, and they'd show them a series of images with a certain number of shapes on them. So they'd show them like a bunch of circles, and one picture would have 3 circles in it, one picture would have 4 circles, one would have 5 circles, etc. And then at the same time, they would play them recordings with a certain number of like bleeps on them.
Right.
And when they played a recording of, let's say, 3 bleeps, then the babies would look towards the picture with 3 circles on it, and it was like they were connecting the, you know, they were counting the number of bleeps and then associating it with the vision. Isn't that incredible?
Yeah,
Like
that is
4 days old.
They can count up to 27 iPads up.
I read a thing about swearing in children, and it took children from 1 to 12, and it just measured a host of different swear words. That's how frequently they use them. And so for 1 and 2 year olds, the most frequent swear word that they use is poopy.
Is this pre-curfew? Because if so, I don't think we're allowed to say that.
That falls off very rapidly by the age of 7 or 8. Jerk is big around 3 and 4 year olds, then tails off, has a huge dip in the graph. Do you know that newborn babies recognise the theme song from their mum's favourite soap opera? They tested this, an old study in 1988. Yeah, they tested it. They also tested them on made up words.
Oh yeah.
So they made up a word like, I don't know, pt2 or something, and they played it to them more than 25,000 times while the mother was pregnant.
Oh my god.
And after birth, unsurprisingly, the baby recognised the word and its variations, and other babies didn't recognise it. Have you heard about the way babies grip? Newborn babies, the strength of their grip. They can grip strongly enough to support their own weight.
Wow.
Yeah,
Really?
and they think this is a hangover from.
I was just going to say, from being a chimp and having
Yeah.
to pull yourself up the hairs or something.
And
So does that mean if you put your finger in a baby's hand and they grab hold of it, you could lift him up?
Yeah. You know how I know that with such confidence? In 1891, back in the good old days, a researcher dangled 60 newborns from a walking stick to see how long they could last.
Wow.
And the longest lasted 2 minutes 35.
Right.
And the shortest lasted 10 seconds.
Oh, wow.
2 minutes 35.
Yeah.
How long was this stick that he could get 16 infants dangling?
That is
60.
incredible.
60.
60.
Yeah.
60.
There must be one at a time.
I think it was, sadly, I think it was one at a time.
Right.
Another thing babies can do, which I think is quite exciting, is they seem to have an innate awareness of organs and how bodies work. So there was a study done where there were like moving toys given to a bunch of toddlers, and then they split the dolls in half. And they showed them to the babies, and they made it so the dolls were completely hollow on the inside, and the babies were really confused. So when they split a doll in half and there was nothing on the inside, the babies would like show obvious signs of bewilderment and like look inside properly, as if to say, "Where the hell are its organs? It's alive."
I don't think that shows detailed knowledge of human anatomy, though.
I wouldn't trust them to do an operation.
Yeah, I'd still go for Dr. A, the adult doctor, and not Dr. B, the baby in the
doctor.
coat. Yeah. Do you know that babies can't taste salt until they're 4 months old?
They can also taste with their cheeks, which we can't do. Isn't that cool?
As in if they could just hold the thing to their cheek. Oh, that is delicious.
It needs more basil.
More salt. I mean, I don't know actually.
It has to be the inside of their cheeks, sadly. But even so, quite cool. Imagine
Taste
if you
buds all over their cheeks.
they've got taste buds on their cheeks.
Very cool.
That would be really fun. It's a weird idea being able to taste with your cheeks. We could promise to it. So I was reading a story in the British Newspaper Archive in the Daily Gazette for Middlesbrough in 1887, and a man's written this letter into the newspaper. This man got on a train in 1887. A man in his early 20s got on the train carriage with him and was holding a baby, even though the man looked very young to be engaged in such a manner. So, you know, early 20s, bit young to have a baby. The baby started crying, and the man pinched the baby quite hard, and it started crying a lot more. And so a couple of women nearby said, "Oh, if you keep doing that, you shouldn't do that to a baby. If you keep doing that, we're going to call security." And the young man said, "I'll do what I like," and taking the baby by its long robe began to swing it around and around so that its head came into contact with the door frame after each revolution, and the shrieking became terrific. And then bang, the train stops, the man gets out, leaving on the seat a broken Yankee rubber baby, which is a prank doll they used to have in the 1880s that apparently young men would take onto trains in order to terrify the living shit out of everyone else.
Wow.
I think you mean the living poopy.
Isn't that weird? It sounded like it was going to be a really traumatic
That's
story.
awful.
And then it was just a doll though, Andy.
It's still awful though.
Yeah,
'cause I
it's
haven't-
still traumatic.
I haven't recovered from the awfulness, which I guess is the whole point of the prank.
Yeah. What a good prank that it's still affecting people, even just
Yes.
hearing about it.
130 years later,
Yeah.
I'm upset.
You're
because of
upset.
that bastard on
This
the train.
man should be so happy. My God, he must be happy in his grave right now. Isn't that
I'm
cool?
glad he's dead.
Okay, time for fact number 2, and that is Chazinski.
My fact is that the first pair of Nike trainers were made in a waffle iron. Who's going to quibble with my pronunciation of Nike?
Nobody.
Okay,
No
great.
ma'am.
Nobody. And I reckon you're asking for a reason, right?
I mean, technically, I guess we should say Nike, because that's how you
No,
pronounce it in ancient
Nike.
Greek. Well, that's how you pronounce the
I
ancient
always
Greek.
say Nike.
You definitely shouldn't say
No,
Nike.
we have got some very exciting news. 2 people wrote to the co-founder of Nike, to ask, and he wrote back to them. It's Nike. They wrote to Philip Knight. He's the chairman, and I believe he's the co-founder.
He should change his name.
Philip Knight.
To Nike.
To Nike. Yeah.
Or we should change it to 90.
But they sent him, and they wrote the phonetic pronunciation of both. All he did was just circle and send it back to them, and he circled -key, as in a key opening a door.
Yeah.
So it's Nike.
Nike was named by the first ever Nike employee, who was called Jeff Johnson. But it means victory in Greek, which you would pronounce in ancient Greek, Nike.
Right.
So, I mean, maybe they're wrong about the pronunciation of their own brand.
But Nike was the goddess. Nike was the goddess of victory. But I read that the thing she did was to fly around the battlefield, lifting people up, bestowing honours on them, and things like that. So she wouldn't ever have needed shoes. Ironic.
No way.
Sorry, waffle iron.
Yeah, sorry, so we should go back to the first pair of Nike trainers were made by Bill Bowerman, who was the Nike co-founder, and he worked for this company making shoes for a few years, but in 1971 they released the first line of completely Nike trainers with the Nike label on them. And the way he designed them was, so they had a special way of gripping the ground. He wanted to design a better pair of running shoes, revolutionise running shoes that could work on a whole bunch of surfaces, and design them with better grip, but not with spikes, like football spikes, which would dig into the ground. And he was discussing this conundrum, how to develop trainers with good grip, with his wife over breakfast. And she got some waffles out of the oven, and she was brainstorming at the time and saying, why don't you try attaching some bits of my jewellery or something to the bottom of shoes and seeing if that works or something like that. And he was like, yeah, you know that waffle you're holding? What if we turn that upside down and put it on the bottom of a trainer? And then he disappeared, went back to his lab, got 2 cans of this liquid plastic that you use to make trainers, came back, seized the waffle iron off his wife, poured the liquid plastic into the waffle iron, and there was born the first sole of Nike trainers, which is that waffle sole.
So I think this resurfaced recently because they found the waffle iron.
Yeah, they did.
And I read that when they found this old waffle iron, which had just been in a rubbish tip at the back of the founder's garden for ages and ages.
Wow.
Do you know why it was in a rubbish tip?
No.
It was because so it wasn't even in a rubbish tip, it was buried because Bill Bowerman, in the place that he lived in America, it was up a hill or something, and it was too far for rubbish truck drivers to come, and so he'd just bury it all in the garden. And his granddaughter or daughter, I think it was a daughter, wasn't it, was just found this a few years ago. It was there's this huge pile of stuff buried in our garden, just rubbish.
He didn't live on a hill at first. He just kept on burying all of his household waste, and eventually he did. But when they discovered this thing, I read this line. It truly is the headwaters of our innovation, Nike historian Scott Ream said. From a historian's standpoint, it's like finding the Titanic. Which it's not.
No, and also, historians do kind of like the Titanic as well, don't they?
Yeah,
It's not
exactly.
like-
Same thing.
It's
yeah.
not like the history equivalent of finding the Titanic, because the Titanic is the history equivalent of finding. But Nike has a historian.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It must be a really easy job up until the mid 20th century. 1875, still nothing.
I don't know, 400 BC, goddess of victory.
1912, Titanic sinks. Don't really give a shit about that.
From a historian's point of view, this would be like finding the first ever Nike shoe.
The waffle iron that was used to make this first pair of trainers had been in use in the Bowerman family since 1936. I thought it was quite
Oh,
impressive.
they must have been pissed off when we broke it.
Yeah, it's so casual, just ruining it.
I don't think he broke it, did he?
He broke it. It was not useful after that.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it tasted of hot plastic.
Do you know where waffles come from? They're actually derived from religious wafers. Used for communion, as well as just to make food. But you used to have wafer irons, which in French are called moule à oubli, and they had biblical scenes on them. That was the first waffle design, and communion wafers normally had a picture of Jesus and his crucifixion on them, because they were for holy use.
Interesting thing about communion wafers is Catholics at least do this. You would go up and they would put the wafer directly into your mouth, and reason that they did that is to stop people from stealing them, because people used to get them in their hands, pretend to put them in their mouths, and then take them home, and they would do like magic incantations with them, or sprinkle them on the crops to make them grow better, or something.
Or pour golden syrup and bacon over them. Enjoy Canadian breakfast. Well, speaking of untrustworthiness, which I guess that speaks to, waferers, which were people who sold waffles or wafers in the 16th, 17th century, were apparently notoriously untrustworthy. So they were described in literature at the time as designing persons, thieves, etc., who took up wafering as a cloak for dishonest practices. And they appear in various literature in the 15th, 16th centuries, like Chaucer, as typically bad people, and they had to be abolished in 1826, the practice of being a waferer, because they were so untrustworthy. Also, I like this quote, I can't remember where I read this, in some history magazine, but it was Charles IX who enacted the first ever waffle legislation in 1560. So as well as being untrustworthy, I think they were quite violent waferers, or oubliés, as you said, they were called in France, and they kept on getting into fights with each other when they were selling too close to one another. So the first waffle legislation was to say exactly how much space there had to be between two wafer sellers, because otherwise they couldn't be trusted not to beat the crap out of each other.
That's why they had a picture of the crucifixion on them. It was Jesus saying, "You have to be this far apart, guys. No fighting."
You were saying about how waffle guys were untrustworthy.
Mhm.
Well, these days they're quite trustworthy. The Waffle House in America, they are famous for staying open no matter what. If there's a disaster, they'll stay open, and they pride themselves on you always be able to go there and get a waffle if there's a problem. And that means that the Federal Emergency Management Agency, if ever they see that a Waffle House is closed, they know that that's the kind of place they need to go and give aid to, because that must be the worst. If the Waffle House closed, then it must be pretty
No
bad.
way, then that's
how
the
they judge
apocalypse.
it. That's amazing. So they always, so when disaster strikes, they still...
When disaster strikes, if there's loads of different counties that are obviously all kind of in trouble,
Yeah.
if the Waffle House is closed in one of them, they'll go,
Wow.
It's quite a good tip though, actually, if you own a Waffle House in a disaster struck area, to close it, and that's going to bring help.
Yeah. Or if you're the mayor of the disaster struck area, blow up the waffle house.
Yes. Yeah.
Also a good tip.
there are 60,000 Nikes which fell off a ship, and they are followed by meteorologists and oceanographers to see the currents of the oceans, in the same way that those rubber ducks were at that time.
Yes.
Did they say things like, "We've been running some experiments"? No? I would have thought they would say that all the time.
Surely. I would love it if you went into that office, you said that, and it was the first time they heard it. And you were the hero of the office. You met Andy, he's amazing.
Hi, I'm here for my training. Are there any trainers about?
I don't want a waffle. Oh no, it's too far. It's too far. They won't get that one.
In the corner, the Nike historian's pissing himself. These shoes that fell off the ship, they're still wearable. If you find them on a beach, you can still wear them, which means that people collect them, and they have impromptu swap meets where people who have two lefts like swap one for the
Wow.
right, or if they
Really?
have two different sizes, they try and swap them.
That's amazing. That's really incredible.
There's a charity called Because International which has developed a shoe that grows with your foot, so that, because it's a major problem in developing countries is that people can't afford shoes, and so they're barefoot all the time, they grow out their shoes, and it can grow up to 7 sizes, I think, so it grows by sort of curving outwards as your foot grows. So as a kid you can have it when you're, 4 and still have it when you're 12. Isn't that so
Wow.
cool?
That is cool. So there's a theory that shoes emerged 40,000 years ago, which is way earlier than our original estimate. We thought that we'd had them for maybe 5 or 10,000 years.
Okay.
But there's a scientist from Washington University called Eric Trinkaus, and he found the time in history where toe bones began to get smaller, because for most of our history we've had really, really big toe bones because we were doing lots of walking and climbing and carrying things around. But then 40,000 years ago, we kept our big leg bones, they stayed the same size, but our toe bones
So
started
we all
getting
used to
smaller.
have like big clown feet.
Yes. Let's say that. Yeah.
Ooh.
And he was trying to work out what would remove stress on toes, but not on legs. And he says, that's shoes.
Yeah, but they couldn't just make bigger shoes to
Yeah.
fit our toe bones in.
I'm not sure how much our toes shrank.
In my imagination, they shrunk quite a lot.
This conundrum, what are we going to do? Our feet won't fit into these tiny shoes we keep making. I guess we'll just have to wait for our feet to evolve into smaller feet.
time for fact number 3, and that is my fact. My fact is rats dream of places they want to visit.
Well, like the Taj Mahal or...
Yeah. Maybe if they basically, whenever a rat gets shown something while they're conscious, they found this in mazes, and they'd see somewhere that they couldn't go to. And then when they went for a nap, rats have naps. Scientists found that they were dreaming about what it'd be like to actually get into that place and then get the thing that they think might be in there. So they start dreaming about all these unattained places that they'd like to visit, because either they've seen a bit of cheese in it, or
And we know that because they look at inside their brains which neurons are firing when they go around the maze when they're awake, don't they? And then when they fall asleep, you look at the same neurons are firing, so they're obviously reliving going around the maze. And it's really sad that we've decided that means the only place a rat wants to visit above and beyond anything else is the bit of food in the maze that we planted there in the experiment they did yesterday.
The interesting thing here is that we can tell what rats are dreaming about.
it's extraordinary, isn't it? From what I've read, and I do find it very hard to break through scientific jargon sometimes, but it sounds like, as Anna was saying, they look at these neurons that are firing off and they can see that they're making similar connections. I think there was a tiny thing about their actual physical movements of their body as well, kind of suggesting, don't laugh, right. I think, I might be wrong about that.
80% of dreams are about normal things like doing the washing up or being at work.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's 100% mine.
But then again, 5.2% of men have kissed a monster in their dreams, 3.4% have had foreplay with an animal, and 1.7% have had sex with an object, plant or rock.
An object. Because plants and rocks are objects. Kissed a monster. Do you think a monster as in like a mermaid or
Is a mermaid a monster?
I think it'd be classified as a monster, yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
a monster truck would come under object.
Yes.
What about some monster munch?
Object.
There's actually a term for people who study dreams in science, and it's oneirology, and it's not what the interpretation is, it's why we dream, and so it's not, if your teeth fall out, you're stressed, that kind of stuff.
There's a really good book by Richard Wiseman called Night School, which has a lot of stuff about dreaming. It says the guy who came up with the term rapid eye movement, I think his name was Surinsky, he nearly called it jerky eye movement. And it had negative connotations to the word jerk. There's a lot of 3 and 4 year olds who used it to slag each other off. Yeah, but it could have been called that.
So humans get erections in dreams, male ones, that is, male humans, and it's during REM sleep, which is usually where dreams happen. A lot of other animals, rats as well, they get them, get erections during REM sleep, but apparently the armadillo is the only animal to get erections in non-REM sleep.
Wow. What?
It's just a fact.
That is so weird.
Is it embarrassing for a rat when it gets an erection, do you think?
A rat.
Yeah, because it's never wearing a jacket, so it won't cover it up.
I always wonder why you always came into work in a jacket, Andy.
It's summer here, and Andy has got this long trench coat on.
I've got another jacket under this one. Rats feel regret after they make a poor choice in life.
Do they?
Yep. They did an experiment where they gave them the chance to eat food now, after waiting for a bit, or just move on to the next thing. And if they chose to move on, then the next food offering was worse. And they paused and they looked at the good reward that they couldn't have. And then later on they changed their decision when they were run through it again. So they think that is them showing regret. And they didn't do it when they encountered bad food without having chosen accidentally the bad food.
We do seem to anthropomorphise rats a lot, or science does at the moment. Like, there are a lot of studies that come out saying, yeah, rats feel regret. There's one that claims rats feel empathy, which is also very plausible. So this study got 2 rats to live together for 2 weeks or something, so they bonded, learned to be mates. And then researchers locked one of them in a cage, which could only be opened by the other rat from the outside. And they found that the other rat would always open the cage, even when there was no apparent benefit for the other rat. So even if opening the cage released the rat into a separate room, so there wasn't even the social advantage of having that rat hang out with you now, the rat would still go and open the cage first thing. I think they even put food in there, and the rat would open the cage before it went and ate the food, because it wanted to free its mate. Apparently, that's what we decided. Isn't it?
That's good. They also they piss on food that they mark as edible.
nothing wrong with that. Have you seen the fridge recently in the office?
I think they're marketing it as formally edible, really.
You had some cake at my last birthday, didn't you? Everyone complained, but it was edible cake. Very moist, this cake.
Is it
It's
irony?
urinal cake.
Is it irony that in the act of signposting something that's edible, you make it no longer edible? Like, that's like a catch-22, isn't it?
All I know is that
22.
no one came to my following birthday.
So on rats' brains, we've managed to get rats to communicate with each other mentally across oceans. So scientists, again, experimenting on rats willy-nilly to their heart's content, but they've connected the brains of a pair of rats, and so one rat can be in the US, one rat can be in Britain, and they've connected their brains up so they can share sensory information with each other, and they've trained the rats so that if they press a lever in a certain box that they're in, then they'll get some food, but they've trained them to communicate mentally with each other, so they'll